Okay, Anna and Gail, are we ready to get started? If so, I'll do a little introduction. My name is Emily, and I'm a librarian at the Oakland Public Library. We're going to get started in just a second, but I want to give you a brief library commercial. First, we are open for sidewalk pickup. We have almost all of our branches operating some sidewalk pickup hours, so you can call or go online and put your favorite book, DVD, or CD, or video game, or Wi-Fi hotspot on hold and come and pick it up at one of our branches. You can also give us a call. We have librarians answering reference questions, actually 7 days a week now. And then we're also trying to do some virtual programming, things like tonight, this League of Women Voters presentation, but we're also doing, on October 14th, we're gonna have a panel presentation about COVID-19 in the Fruitvale District. That will be in Spanish, so please keep that in mind. And then at the end of October, we are working with Fresh Approach to do some veggie cooking and nutrition classes, and people who participate in those classes, which will also be on Zoom, will get vouchers that are good for local farmers markets. We're also doing things like we've got a virtual lawyers in the library. We have the Oakland Tenants Union doing a help for renters every other week. And then we have ongoing an ESL club and several book clubs. So do check us out, check out our Facebook for some other cool video programming that the children's librarians are doing, or our website, or give us a call. Thank you so much for being here. It's definitely seeming really important that we are informed and involved in politics now. It was really nice to hear Gail say earlier that this is her favorite part of election season, because for me, sometimes things can seem pretty dire. So it's really nice to get that reminder that there are people that are working for us to help us be informed and active citizens, and that makes me personally feel really good. I hope it does you too. So I'd like to introduce Anna Matai and Gail Wallace, who are from the League of Women Voters, and they're going to do a presentation of about an hour on ballot pros and cons with time for questions. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. If you're here in the Zoom room, we can also let you speak at certain times. So if you'd like to ask your question verbally, just put that in the chat as well. Without further ado, thank you so much, Gail and Anna. It's all yours.
Terrific. So thank you so much for inviting the League to make this presentation on the November ballot measures. Just a little history on us. The League of Women Voters is a grassroots nonpartisan organization of women and men. So nonpartisan means we never support or oppose political parties or candidates. We were founded 100 years ago, so it's our 100th anniversary, and our goal is to safeguard democracy and make it work by building a society of informed and participating citizens at all levels of government. So the League has two branches. There's the action and advocacy branch that may advocate for legislation or ballot measures. We represent today the voter services and education branch. So we are working to present complete information and arguments on all sides of an issue. So I'm Anna Matai, and I'm here with Gail Wallace. We are going to review all the state propositions first, then pause for questions, and then we'll go to the local measures and then have more time for more questions. So Gail, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome and thank you to all of you who have turned out this evening. It really is a pleasure to be able to share this information, and I think important for all of us to stay informed. I want to start out by sharing a statistic I have heard repeatedly for what people retain when they expose themselves to a bunch of substantive material, whether through an online course or lecture or otherwise through a program like this evening. And it may surprise you that the average retention is just 30%. But I don't think we should be daunted by that. I think it just means that it takes us a while when we're dealing with complex matters. So it's early in the election season, and I want you to realize that you can take this first pass tonight, get a sense of what will be on the ballot, and we will be sharing a wealth of resources with you at the end of the program on the League's website and links to other sources of information as well. So this is the beginning. I also want to mention one thing that is often a source of misconception, which is that you do not have to vote on all measures. If it feels daunting to you to get up to speed on all measures, that when you go to the ballot, you can go and vote on those measures that matter to you, that you feel are especially significant, and those on which you feel you have actually been able to form an opinion. Also, you should remember that these ballot measures come to the ballot for your consideration for a variety of reasons. And when you keep that in mind, it may help you sort these different ballot measures for their significance. Sometimes it's a private company or entity that wants a result that will favor their business. Sometimes it's an association or a nonprofit that espouses a particular public policy. And sometimes it's a constitutional change that's being proposed that actually has to, it's mandated that such constitutional changes come before the voters in a ballot measure. So we'll see a little bit of all of those reasons at play this evening, and you can take it into account in your response. I'm going to start out with the first three ballot measures. We've grouped them, and these three all have to do with money. So for that reason, may be among the most complex. The first one is Prop 14. It has to do with stem cell research. The background here is that in the early 2000s, stem cell research showed great promise for giving us treatments for many different kinds of diseases. Stem cells, I'll just remind you, are embryonic cells, which are not yet specialized for a particular function. And in the 2000s, researchers were developing lines of stem cells that were originating in human fetal tissue. There was controversy about that, and the federal government stopped funding stem cell research. In 2004, California voters responded and said, we want this research to continue. We believe in the value that searching for treatments holds for our people. So the voters approved a $3 billion bond measure in 2004. Again, a little aside, just as a reminder, bonds are a borrowing tool. The state borrows money to fund something, in this case, stem cell research. It's usually for large infrastructure projects, but here for stem cell research, and taxpayers repay those bonds, the original debt plus interest, over a term of years. So the $3 billion bond measure was passed. Those monies were used to establish the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. They funded research and internships, which have resulted in more than 3,000 research papers and 64 clinical trials. At the moment, there is only $300 million left of the original $3 billion bond measure. And in the interim, since 2004, the federal government has resumed funding stem cell research. So that's our situation. Prop 14 is on the ballot because the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine and other research groups and patient advocate groups are asking the state of California to float another $5.5 billion worth of bonds. And that is to be able to continue the work that was begun in 2004. I should mention it's not unusual for there to be a 10 to 20 year timeline on getting results from research. What will be funded is slightly different, just in the sense that there are limits on administrative costs, and that there has been $1.5 billion of this $5.5 billion earmarked for research and treatment, specifically of brain and neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And there's also a little bit more focus on access to treatments in what they're proposing doing going forward. But otherwise, this is a measure simply to renew the coffers and allow them to continue their work. The bonds will be issued over the course of 11 years, and there will be $2.3 billion worth of interest that must be paid, as well as the original $5.5 billion bond measure. It's possible that there would be royalties for the state of California if new inventions came out of some of the research. California would get 3% on those type of inventions and royalties initially, but that is a very uncertain rate of return. It's completely for the future to determine that. And we have Anna's slide, thank you, which is going to show you, and we'll do that for each of the measures, who's a proponent and who's an opponent. And you can see here, the $3 sign represents, Anna, help me out here, millions?
Million,
Yes.
yeah, more than $1 million.
Yes, so the Klein Corporation is in the millions, juvenile and diabetes research in the hundreds of thousands. $1 sign is tens of thousands. There's no particular organized research on this. And this measure is basically one of those where you have a group that believes in a certain public policy supporting scientific research, and opponents question whether that's the correct role for the state government. And they also ask whether this is the right time given the current state of finance and crisis in the country. So let's move to the second measure in this set of three, and that's Prop 15, which has to do with taxes on commercial property. Here again, we need to get a bit into the history. I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with it. Back in 1978, more than 40 years ago now, the famous Prop 13 was passed. And what it did was regulate property taxes. And it rolled back the assessed values of all properties to their 1975 level and said, your tax bill will be 1% of whatever that 1975 valuation is, and it will not be able to increase more than 2% a year unless the property is sold. When the property changes hands, then we will reassess the property and we will retax it at whatever its market rate is at that moment of sale. That rule covered all properties, residential and commercial and industrial and agricultural. It was universal, but it's had very different effects with respect to commercial and industrial properties. And that's for several reasons. These properties do not turn over as often as residential properties do. Therefore, they are not reassessed. Particularly the largest industrial and commercial properties turn over less often. That's sometimes because they're owned by corporations. So the corporation stays the same. I mean, Disney is Disney, Chevron is Chevron, right? And unless 51% of the ownership actually changes hands, then it's not considered a sale of the property. And so it's not reassessed. So there are some very, very large businesses and commercial properties in the state of California that have not been reassessed in the entire 40-year plus era that has transpired since Prop 13 was passed. So this Prop 15, in that background, proposes to assess commercial and industrial properties, not when they're sold, because that doesn't happen as regularly as it does with residential properties, but instead simply to reassess them every several years, probably every 3 years. So it's a change in the timing of the assessment for commercial properties, not the rate of taxation. And there are no changes in this measure that would affect residential properties or agricultural properties or businesses that are worth less than $3 million. And additionally, in order to not make it too rude of a transition, there will be no taxes on equipment, fixtures, and furnitures for businesses that have fewer than 30 employees. And even for all the other businesses that might be affected, the first $500,000 worth of value of their equipment and fixtures and furnitures will not be taxed. One reason why this proposition may be the one that merits a great deal of attention is that it, if passed, would have a very big impact on the state revenues. On the revenues, particularly of schools and local communities who would be the beneficiaries. It is projected that if this measure passes, it will generate between $6.5 and $11.5 billion in revenue each year. These monies would go to schools, 40%, and to community services, 60%, which would include social services and fire and police departments. So a very big impact. But the proponents of this measure point out that 92% of the revenue is going to come from 10% of the commercial properties in the state, because we just have some properties that are so large and valuable now and have not been reassessed for a very long time. So there's a huge discussion here. And could we see the slide, Anna, as to who is taking part in this discussion? Those people who are proponents of this measure say large companies should be paying their fair share, and that local governments and schools have suffered from reduced revenues because they haven't been for the last 40 years. And the opponents claim this is going to hurt small businesses. I've already mentioned to you how the proponents say they've tried to take care of businesses by excluding all small businesses worth less than $3 million and by giving them some tax breaks on their equipment. The proponents also point out that businesses thrive when they are located in healthy communities and have an educated workforce, and that therefore there is a benefit to communities to having their social services and their schools and community colleges well funded. And there's a final debate about whether or not small businesses will receive rent increases that would be passed along. That's the argument made by the people who are against this measure. But the proponents say it's not taxes that drive what rents are for small businesses, it's the availability of property and space. So it's a question of a decision, how you think the state should tax these commercial and industrial properties to account for the fact that they do not turn over quite as often as the residential properties, and therefore are paying less of a percentage of the property taxes than they were when this measure passed. Third one, last one with the money, and that's Proposition 19. Interestingly, Proposition 19, and perhaps confusingly, also deals with Prop 13 that we just described, that passed in 1978. Only Prop 19 does not deal with commercial properties and industrial properties, it deals with homeowners' properties. And the most homeowners who stay in their homes for a long time start to realize a very distinct advantage, because their property was assessed when they bought it. And that assessment and taxes can only rise by 2% per year. Taxes can only rise. So over time, if they stay a long time, their property is much lower than people who have come new to the neighborhood and bought a new property at market rates. All right, so there's been that situation, but that in itself creates an incentive for people never to move out of their homes because they want to keep that tax advantage of lower taxes. So there have been some exceptions voted upon by the voters over the years, and they said people over 55, people who are disabled, people who have suffered as victims of natural disasters can move once and keep this tax advantage, bring it to their new property. Okay, and Anna, you might want to move to that table. So the current situation now is that you could buy a new home of less or similar value, and you could move somewhere within the 10 counties who participate in this, and you could do it one time as a senior or as a disabled person or as someone who had suffered a disaster. So the proposal is now you can buy a home less, same, or more value, that you could take the tax advantage that you have to any place in California, and that seniors and disabled people could do this 3 times in their lifetime. So that's one aspect of Prop 19. It's a complicated measure because it has an entirely other aspect as well, which is that right now, if your children and grandchildren inherit your house and you have this tax advantage because you've been an owner there for a long time, they get the tax advantage as well. They inherit that. The property is not reassessed when it passes from parents to children or grandparents to grandchildren. This Proposition 19 would change that and say you can only keep that advantage if you use the house as your principal residence. What's the fiscal effect of this? Well, with respect to the first change, one jurisdiction's loss is another one's gain, because if you take your low tax basis to a new county, you're paying them less in taxes than they would pay if you moved into that county and bought a new house at market value. On the other hand, the county or city that you left, someone will buy your original house. They will buy it at market rate, and therefore they will pay higher taxes than you were paying. And so that county or town will benefit. The inheritance rule change is estimated that it will possibly generate quite a bit of funds for the state of California. And money brought in by this measure will go to the California Fire Response Fund and the County Revenue Protection Fund, which will be in the state treasury. And every 3 years, there will be disbursements from those funds. So while this measure, could we see the proponents and opponents, Anna, has been brought by realtors because it's likely to support more sales of homes, because seniors and other people affected will be able to sell their home and move more often and keep their tax advantages. Still, it does offer benefits that are beyond the benefits that realtors see for themselves, which are the increased revenues from the change in the inheritance tax principally. So again, a value judgment as to where public policy should be on these measures. So those are the three first ones that we've grouped together. Anna's got a group of her own. I'm going to turn it over to her for the moment.
Great, thank you. So the next three propositions are related to criminal justice reform and crime. And so we start with Prop 13, and this is voting rights for people on parole. So currently people on parole cannot vote, and Prop 17 would change that. Why? So supporters say that when people complete their prison sentences and go on parole, they should be encouraged to reintegrate into society and have a stake in their community. So voting is a key part of that. Opponents say parole is part of the criminal sentence and so should not offer full liberty, including voting rights. So just to give you an idea of the numbers, currently there are about 50,000 Californians on parole. And if we look at who is for and who is against, this is a campaign that doesn't have money going into it, but you see the supporters on the left and you see the opponents on the right. So the second of our criminal justice, if you will, propositions is Prop 25. So this is yes or no on getting rid of bail. So what's the background here? Today, if a person is arrested and they are placed in jail, depending on how serious the crime is, the suspect's criminal history, and some other factors, they could be eligible for bail. And bail provides a financial guarantee that after release, the suspect will return to court for their trial. So this current system puts a heavier burden on low-income suspects, because if they cannot afford bail, they have to either wait in jail or they have to borrow from a bail bond agent or a bail bond dealer who will charge them a non-refundable fee. So in 2018, California passed a law to eliminate the bail system and replace it with a risk assessment system, which would say high-risk suspects stay in jail, low-risk suspects can be released to await trial at home. But that law didn't go into effect because the opponents blocked it by filing this referendum. So they're taking basically the law to the people and saying, if this referendum passes, the law will take effect, otherwise it will not. So supporters, what do they say? So supporters say this reform is needed as the bail system keeps poor defendants and defendants of color in jail, or they are stuck with large debt to pay off their bail bond fees. Opponents say the new system of risk assessments will cost the taxpayers a lot of money to set up, and the end result is the communities will be less safe. So if we take a look at the money again, on the left side, you have the proponents, and on the right side, you have those against it, and a number of those companies are related to the bail bond industry. Just give you a minute to look through that. Great. And going on to the third of this bundle, if you will, Prop 20. So this is the changes to the criminal penalties and parole. So if the first two were sort of going one way in criminal justice, this one goes the other way. And the background there is, in the past decade, California has passed 3 measures to reduce the state prison population of those convicted of non-violent, less serious crimes. So these measures include reclassification of some non-violent, non-serious crimes as misdemeanors, which then offers more opportunities for resentencing and parole. So this proposition would change many of the provisions of the measures, these measures that have been passed over the last many years. So the supporters say our current laws aren't tough enough to deter crime, and that the list of crimes classified as violent needs to be expanded. While the opponents say this proposition is going to roll back prison reforms, it's going to cost taxpayers millions of dollars annually. It's going to disproportionately affect vulnerable minorities, and it's not going to make us any safer. So again, if we look at the dollars, so supporters on the left side, and you see the amounts again, $3 is over $1 million, $2 for 100,000, and 1 for less than that. And then on the right side, you see those against the measure. All right, then Gail, I will turn it right back to you.
Great. All right, so now we have 3 more. These are not related to each other, so I'll just take them in sequence. Proposition 16 concerns diversity and poses the question whether California and local governmental entities can consider diversity of race, ethnicity, sex, and national origin in matters of education and employment and contracting. Again, a little bit of history because context is so helpful with respect to these measures. Before 1996, this was what was happening in California. Universities had programs to consider these factors when they were admitting students. Public entities considered them when they were hiring faculty and staff, or in choosing what individuals and companies would win the bid on government contracts. Things changed in 1996 when Proposition 209 was brought before the voters. And Proposition 209 did pass, and it forbade the state of California and local government entities to take these factors into account. So Proposition 16 is asking us to revisit that decision that voters made with respect to Proposition 209. And they want to, again, the proponents, they want again to allow public entities to consider these characteristics. There's no requirement imposed by Proposition 16 that government entities take these factors into account in any particular way. And absolutely no quotas are being proposed. It's simply opening the door for the government entities to again start to use these factors. The equal protection clauses of the federal and state constitution apply no matter what happens, whether it passes or it doesn't. And those clauses, those aspects of the Constitution protect all people who are situated equally. The proponents of this measure argue that not everyone's situated equally because of historical and structural inequities. And the reason for taking account of these factors is to account for that difference in circumstances. And your decision as a voter is to say, do you think outcomes are better in government and education if diverse segments of the population are conversing together, sharing their perspectives? Do you think we should, via this measure, try to take account of historic and structural inequities? Or do you think that none of these factors should be considered and that we would be perpetuating stereotypes by taking these factors into consideration? These are the arguments that the opponents are making. Can we see who's on the other side? Yeah. I should note while you're taking a look at this, that the universities, for example, did find some other ways to try and foster some diversity in student admissions by considering, for example, whether students were the first in their families to go to college, or to consider what geographical areas they came from. But nonetheless, once 209 was passed, there was a decline in the diversity of the student body. So that's part of the background behind the push to bring back the ability to consider this. Okay, let's move on to Prop 21, local governments and rent control. Even though this measure is all about rent, I think we need to be very clear that it's the extreme shortage of housing, and particularly affordable housing in California, that's driving measures like these. Because behind it all, we're struggling to find ways to ameliorate the crisis of homelessness and to stabilize people's living situations. And the proponents of this measure think this is a way to do that. Again, a little history. In the 70s and 80s, different cities throughout California, I think maybe a baker's dozen of them, had different rent control laws. And so in 1995, there was a statewide law passed called Costa, Hawkins, which attempted to regulate the situation throughout the state and to move away from the situation where the situation varied significantly depending on which city that you were living in. So when Costa Hawkins was passed in 1995, it said that a city could only impose rent control on a building that was built before 1995, that it could not impose rent control on any single family homes, and that when a rental was vacated, the landlord could raise the rent to the market rate. So Proposition 21 proposes to amend Costa Hawkins. And it says, instead of applying it only to buildings built before 1995, you can now apply rent control to any buildings built before 2005. So an additional 10 years there. Those properties can now be brought under rent control. And that you could impose rent control on single family homes in cases where the owner has more than 2 rental properties. The final change is that when a rental property is vacated, this amendment would allow landlords to raise the rent for the new tenant only by 5% a year for the first 3 years. So rather than immediately being able to raise the rent to market value after a tenant vacated, the new tenant would benefit from a limitation on the raising of the rent. So this is again a question, what's going to move us on the path towards addressing homelessness and the lack of affordable housing? And the outcome here is uncertain, both in terms of fiscal effect and what will happen in any measure, because it's up to the cities to decide whether they implement the rent control. This isn't imposing rent control on them. It's just setting limits to what kind of rent control programs could be enacted. What are some of the possible outcomes? Some landlords might choose to sell their rental properties because they would want to avoid regulation, and that would take rental properties off the market. Possibly the value of some rental properties would decrease because you would have more limitation on rent increases. But possibly some renters would spend less on rent, and some people would move less often because they had the protections of rent control. Anna, can we see the slide of those for and against? It's quite significant if you look here. We've got, this may be one of the most evenly balanced campaigns in terms of money spent for and against. And it's a really tough one because it isn't a direct path to a result. And there are arguments as to what the impacts would be, both for and against. Okay, the final one, of my second grouping of 3. And this would be an example of something that comes to the ballot because companies would like to have something enacted into law that would benefit their business. And the question on Proposition 22 is whether app-based rideshare and delivery drivers should be classified as independent contractors rather than employees. And you know now that probably there was a law passed last year, you may have heard about it because there's been quite a bit in the news, called AB 5. And AB 5 limited the ability of all companies throughout the state of California to hire workers as independent contractors. It set very strict criteria. And those criteria would force the companies who run app-based rideshare and delivery services to classify their employees, their workers as employees. Companies do not want to do that. The Attorney General of California has sued them and there's a lawsuit going on, but the companies have brought this ballot measure to try and have the issue decided by the voters. So if this passes, then these companies would be allowed to continue to classify their workers as independent contractors. They are sweetening the pot by offering a kind of minimum compensation to workers, saying they would get paid 120% of the minimum wage, but that would only be for the time that they were driving, not the time between runs. Their companies are also offering some healthcare subsidy. They would carry insurance for some medical expenses that might be incurred during the course of drivers at work. And there would be a rest policy for drivers who had been working for more than 12 hours a day. However, these things that are being offered would not be the same as what workers would receive as employees, where there would be minimum compensation for all of the time that they are working, and health care and unemployment compensation and workers' comp. So what would be the fiscal consequences of this? It might be that there would be lower costs and higher profits for these companies, okay, because they're not having to provide all that they would have to provide if they classified these workers as employees. It might also be that drivers and stockholders would pay more in taxes because they might realize more income as independent contractors. So supporters of this measure, and we could look at that slide while I'm going over some of the arguments, and you won't be surprised here to see that there's in the list of supporters putting in millions of dollars, you've got Lyft, Uber, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, the leading app-based transportation and delivery companies. And we have a great disproportion here. This might be the slide that has the greatest disproportion in the expenditures on both sides of the account. Anyway, the proponents say that classifying drivers as employees would lead to longer wait times, higher prices, and less access for the public. But the opponents say that if this passes, it's going to eliminate workplace protections and replace them with lower guaranteed earnings. So it's, and if this doesn't pass, it would go back to the courts where the lawsuit is wending its way. Thank you, Anna.
Great. All right, so the next 3, and those would be the 3 state propositions, and we'll take a break for questions after that. So Proposition 23 about kidney dialysis clinics. So people who suffer from late-stage kidney diseases, need dialysis to survive, and what dialysis is doing is filtering the toxins and waste from their blood. So there are about 600 dialysis clinics in California. And what this proposition is saying is that the clinics must have a licensed doctor on site during the treatment, with a few exceptions. that the clinics should offer the same level of care, regardless of whether the payment is by private insurance or by government, and that the clinics need state permission to cut services or close down. So the supporters say these requirements are necessary to offer safe treatment with transparent functioning to financially vulnerable clients. And the opponents say, clinics are already well regulated and these additional requirements would be burdensome. It would force some community clinics to close and it would worsen our shortage of doctors. So the for and against, again, the proponents on the left and those against on the right, and Davita and Fresnius, own the most for-profit clinics in California. Okay, I'm going to go on to Prop 24, which is changes to consumer privacy laws. So the background here is with the internet, with our technology used today, there is a lot of concern about maintaining our privacy, who's collecting, who's profiting from our data. And so a law was passed in California in 2018, which brought us some protections around notifying users about data collection, options to opt out, data privacy rights, and fining violators if they break the law. So this proposition would change a number of things, including creating a California Privacy Protection Agency, to go after violators, and directing individual websites to not share or sell your private information, and mandating sort of immediate penalties for violations. So supporters say that the current law, the one that was passed in 2018, does not have enough teeth, and having this ballot initiative would make the privacy laws less vulnerable to being watered down by lobbyists. So the opponents say there's just way too many loopholes. This is a 52-page proposition. Opponents say companies could charge more for privacy protection. That's not fair. And that consumers have to opt out one website at a time. Overall, the state law, while it passed in 2018, gave companies a year or so to sort of comply. And so it's just being started. It's just taking effect in 2020. So overall, the opponents say, give the state law time to take hold and play out before trying to change this with the proposition. And if we look at the money, and again, on the left side, it is heavily funded by a real estate developer who has a lot of concerns about privacy. And then you see sort of a slew of people on both sides who are for and against the proposition. So the last of the state propositions is Prop 18. It's around voting rights for 17-year-olds. So the proposal is to allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primary election if they will be 18 by the upcoming general election. So if you were born in October, when it's March, you're still 17, but come November, you're 18. And so the thinking is you should be allowed to vote in the primary because you want to influence who you might ultimately vote for or not in the general election. So supporters say it'll enable more youth to vote as they will participate in the full election cycle. And in general, we should encourage more voting. While opponents say, 17-year-olds aren't mature enough to make important decisions, they're going to be influenced by their schools and their teachers to vote one way or the other. And this should really be an independent thing. So heads up, there is also a local measure on youth voting that we will review right after we take a pause here for questions on state propositions and then come back for the local. So Emily.
Thank you so much, Anna and Gail. So I don't currently see any questions on our Facebook page, but we do have one in the question and answer here, or two actually. If anybody else who is listening has a question, if you could please either type it in the chat or the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question out loud, and I can allow you to talk. The first question I can answer, it's will this recording be available to rewatch later? And the answer is yes. If you emailed us for the link to this Zoom, after this presentation, I will email you the link to a YouTube link that's the recording of this presentation. The question that I see, there's two. The first is more of a statement. It says, it would be useful to discuss the calculations for if one purchases a new house, for example, the $1 million aspect. I'm not sure which proposition this is referring to. Maybe the maybe Prop 19. If you made this comment and you want to give us more information, will you please write in the chat or raise your hand? The second question I see is about Prop 21, and they want to know if it applies only to single-family rental houses.
So Prop 21 is about rent control, so it would apply to all rental units should the jurisdiction decide to adopt rent control. Okay, so only rental properties. And previously it wouldn't have applied to single family homes at all, but now it could apply. The rent control could apply to single family homes that are being rented, provided the owner has at least 2 rental properties.
Thank you, Gail. And I see one more question. This is about Prop 15. They would like to know, are there any details for how much of that revenue benefits police?
Interesting. No, because it would be up to each city, because these funds would go into the general fund of the cities and also be dispersed to counties, so to local entities that benefit from property taxes, and it would be up to them to allocate it among general services to the population, social services, and police and fire, and other functions of any municipal or county government.
Thank you so much, Gail. I don't see any other questions. Are there any other questions? I think we are okay to move on. I don't see any questions, and I will have another opportunity at the end of the presentation for questions. So I'll go ahead and let you continue.
Terrific. All right, so then on to the local measures. We've got 3 from the city of Oakland. We've got 1 from OUSD, the Oakland School District, and we've got 1 from Alameda County. All of them require a simple majority to pass, except for the 1 from the school district. It's a bond, and that requires 55%. Okay, so let's go on to these. So Measure QQ, you remember the one from the state about allowing youth to vote. So this is a more specialized one allowing youth to vote in school board elections. So, as you know, voting is limited to voters who are 18 years and older. A campaign led by students in Oakland has championed at youth who are ages 16 and 17. So they're too young to vote, but otherwise are eligible to vote under law, should have a say in school board elections because school boards, their decisions affect them directly. Little local background here, Berkeley passed a city measure in 2016, but the details are still being worked out, so the law hasn't gone into effect. And there's some measure similar to this in San Francisco that's on the ballot. So what this measure really says is if it passes, then the city council could adopt this plan. So let me just show you again who the supporters and opponents are. Typically in local measures, we don't have dollars. So it's, again, supporters and opponents, but no real money going into campaigning one way or the other. So some of the arguments from the supporters are, school board elected officials would be more responsive to students if the students could actually vote them in or out. And again, voting at an earlier age sets lifelong patterns. We really need to encourage voting as much as possible, starting as young as possible. There were no filed arguments by the opponents, but general arguments are that, youth younger than 18 have little experience. The decisions that school boards make are quite complicated, all the budget decisions, and there could be other ways to increase voter participation rather than this measure. So going on to Measure Y then, this is Oakland School Repairs Safety Improvement. It's a $735 million bond. So what's the background here? Over the last year, Oakland schools have identified about 3.4 billion in repairs and improvements. So this is a whole range of infrastructure needs. And what this bond measure would do, if it passes, would be to support the highest priority projects for basic health and safety improvements, things like repairing deteriorating classrooms, plumbing, electrical systems, air conditioning, leaky roofs. Funds from sale of bonds are infrastructure, so the funds will not be used for salaries or other school operations. And the measure does include accountability safeguards, and the funds will be monitored by an oversight committee. So what are the numbers we're talking about? So it's a $735 million 30-year bond. So it would raise an estimated $48.5 million annually. The bonds would be repaid by increasing property tax, which sort of increases as the bonds are sold. So when all the bonds are sold, so this is an estimate of the highest tax increase, it would be $60 for every 100,000 of assessed valuation. So just a quick look again at the supporters on the left and the opponents on the right. And arguments from the supporters are, our students need and deserve clean, safe learning environments. There's also a need now to upgrade technology for distance learning and also to support social distancing during the pandemic. So the bond measure could be used for that. And in addition, the supporters say Measure Y will ensure that schools have the money to provide the match necessary to secure available state funding. And often that has a condition of matching. The general arguments from the opponents are bonds are a bad way to pay for school repairs and that taxes are already high. Give it a minute here. So I'm going to go on to Measure W, which is an Alameda County measure, and the proposal here is to increase Alameda County sales tax by 0.5 cent. So in Oakland, that would increase our sales tax from 9.25% to 9.75% if this measure passes. So it is being framed as a homelessness issue. Homelessness is an acute problem in our city, and the number of homeless people in Alameda County has doubled over the last 4 years. Unfortunately, it is likely to get worse under the economic downturn resulting from COVID. So this measure would increase the money available in the county general fund, which could help provide housing and services for those experiencing homelessness, mental health services, job training, strengthen the social safety net, as well as provide other general fund services. Show you the supporters and the opponents here. And some arguments from the supporters are, homelessness is a critical issue. We need to allocate as much as possible to solve this crisis and also help those at risk for becoming homeless from actually doing so. Opponents, say our sales tax is already one of the highest in the state. Sales tax are regressive, they hurt the poor more, and they say that framing this as a tax increase to alleviate homelessness is misleading, because the money is going into the general fund and it could be spent on other needs also. Sorry about that. Measure S1. So this is related to the Oakland Police Commission. And some background here. In November 2016, voters approved Measure LL, which established the Oakland Police Commission to review and oversee practices and policies of the Oakland Police Department. So it also established the Community Police Review Agency, so that's part of the commission, and that investigates report of police misconduct. However, in the past year plus, the police commission and the city disagree. They've been at a stalemate about which of the two has the authority to hire staff, and so the police commission has been fully staffed. So what this measure specifically would do is empower the police commission to hire and supervise its staff and establish its office of a civilian inspector general. That would be the office that would investigate reports of police misconduct. And the measure also expands the scope of the commission to include areas identified for improvement by the federal monitor, by federal oversight. We'll just go to supporters. So supporters of this measure say, the police commission needs to be fully staffed in order to be functional and effective. And with this measure, the police commission will be empowered to sustain the progress made by the federal oversight of the police after the oversight ends. Again, we are quoting signed supporters and opponents here, and there were none filed that are signed. So this is the last measure, RR, and it is about removing a specific dollar limit on fines from the city charter. So what's the background? The upper limit on fines for breaking city ordinances, city laws, is specified in the charter as a specific amount. And today that amount is $1,000. It was set back in 1968, over 50 years ago. And today, it's probably inadequate to deter major violators like illegal dumping. So what this measure would do is it would allow the city council to set a new upper fine limit after a public hearing. And then in the future, if that limit needs to be increased, the city council can do so again after a public hearing. They wouldn't have to come back to the public again with a ballot measure. So again, you've got the supporters and you've got the opponents. And the supporters say, the city council needs this flexibility to set fines at levels that effectively deter major violations without coming back to a ballot measure every time. While the opponents are concerned that it would allow the city to impose unlimited fines, and that this measure is not necessary to deal with illegal dumping. So I am just going to stop here with a list of resources. Again, like Gail said, this is a lot of information. So here are a few resources. Again, to register, check your registration at AC Vote. You see your ballot, you go to votersedge.org, you want to put your address in, and it gives you the entire ballot from president all the way down. After you vote, this is where you could track your ballot. And with the league, again, we encourage you to go to lwvo.org. And on the left, you've got voter and election resources. You've got a wealth of resources around, there's videos, there's pros and cons in writing for both the state and the local. And as always, we would also encourage you to join the league. Emily, back to you.
Thank you so much. I do have a few more questions. So I'm going to, I'll tell you what those are in a minute. For my participants, I do have a link to a survey that I will post in the chat, and if you have a chance to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. It's just did you like the program? How did you hear about it? What else can we do for you? The first question that I have for you, Anna and Gail, is from our Facebook account, and the question is back about the rent control proposition. She's wondering if Oakland currently has rent control. What about other jurisdictions in Alameda County?
Well, I think there's some rent directives from the state because of the COVID situation that are applying statewide. And otherwise, I do not know the specifics about which cities in Alameda County have rent control, but I'm writing that question down. So the next time I do that, I can provide this answer.
Thank you, Gail. You can also, if you want to, you can email us at the library or call us. That's a reference question that we would be able to spend a little time researching and answering for you. That information is on the library website. I have another question for you, Anna and Gail. On Measure W, how are those general funds usually used? Or how can we find out how it's usually used?
So Measure W, again, the dollars for Measure W will go into the general fund. I don't have a specific place, but again, you've got, there's the county, city, everybody typically releases a budget. And that would be the place to look, but I don't have a specific site in mind. I don't know, Gail, if you have anything else to add.
So I think the general fund, the reason for it's called general, it's opposed to limited funds, which are targeted for specific purposes. And in its budgeting, the county cannot use those funds for anything other than the targeted purpose. With the general funds, they can move things around and say, we need a little bit more here, we need a little bit more there. So over the whole range of the services that are provided by the county, they could choose to prioritize one or the other within the general fund. And the social services are, helping people stabilize a housing situation, healthcare, outreach, childcare programs, a wide range of services.
Thank you, Gail. And I have one final question in the chat. I have, oops, my chat just disappeared. Hold on, I gotta get it back. There it is. Some opponents to Prop 15 say that while agricultural land will be exempt, fixtures and improvements on that land, irrigation systems, barns, dairies, fences, processing plants, silos, refrigeration units, storage sheds, as well as mature fruit trees and vineyards are not. How much truth is there in that argument?
I think that you have to go back to the categories that are being used in Prop 15, which is to say, no residential properties, no agricultural properties. And those properties include many of the things that you are mentioning that are very closely aligned with their agricultural nature. Okay, so then they're not going to be reassessed. It is possible, because you're talking about everything, a lot of things from dairies to vineyards, that some of these properties would be a mixture of agricultural and industrial or commercial. So for example, think of a vineyard where you have the plants, you have the grapes, you have that on the agricultural side, but then maybe you have a tasting room, maybe you sell bottled wine from that same place. So you would have a mixture. These kinds of decisions in mixed kinds of properties are going to be brought to the assessors and the State Board of Equalization, and these kind of details would be worked out over the first year, next year, because Proposition 15 would not become effective until the year after that. But the basic decision that they will make is in terms of how they're classifying things according to being really closely connected with the agricultural function of the property, even if they are fixtures and improvements, or whether they're more associated with a commercial side of the property, because you can have a mixture of the both. But the reassessment that they're talking about, the regular reassessment of value under Prop 15, would apply to commercial properties or the commercial dimension of mixed properties.
Thank you so much. I don't think there are further questions. Let's maybe give people a minute to go ahead and type something in if there's a question.
Emily, can I add one thing while people are thinking?
Yeah,
that
please,
we've been talking about the propositions here tonight, but if you go to the League's website and you go on the left panel and you look at the election materials, you will see there is also a great deal of information about the candidates running for office in Oakland. And there are forums that the League puts on, because we never take a position. We remain strictly neutral with regard to candidates for office. That sets us up to be impartial arbiters at these forums. And sometimes we partner with other organizations in the city to put them on, but they give you an opportunity to hear all the candidates for different offices present their case. And Anna's showing you the schedule that's available, and that there's a button on the website where you can register for any of these events, and they're being taped. so that you can watch them later on YouTube if you miss the actual event itself.
It's really just wonderful the work that the League does, and I really appreciate that there's an organization that is committed to this impartial information provision. It's so important. One more thing that you do is you provide the Easy Voter Guide, which we actually have paper copies of at the library. We just got them in, I think, yesterday, so they're mostly at our main library right now, but we will have some at other sidewalk pickup location sites. If you can't wait for your paper copy, please email us at engagement@oaklandlibrary.org, and I can send one to a location for you. So, I mean, not your home, but I could send one to a library branch for you to pick up. I think it's also available as a PDF on the League's website, I think.
Yes.
It looks like we're scrolling to it there.
Yeah.
I think that we have answered everybody's questions. I'm seeing some people say thank you very much. I saw somebody on Facebook say that you are very clear and concise, and thank you so much. I think it's really wonderful to be able to just hear simply and clearly the basics of what's going on. If that, I think we are ready to say goodnight to the two of you and to all of our panelists. I think we can all relax a little bit, hopefully, and enjoy this clean air, which I am grateful for. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming.
Great. Thank you for having us. Thank you for
Thank you all.
joining.
Thank you, Emily.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Night.
All right, take care. Go ahead, and I'm gonna